Now, let me tell you about a time when folks still believed in the goodness of strangers, when a woman's worth wasn't measured by her looks but by the size of her heart. This here's a story about Martha Lewis. Lord rest her soul, and how she came to find love in the most unexpected place, back in 1883, out in Colorado Territory. Life was harder than a $2 steak, and loneliness could kill a person just as sure as a rattlesnake bite. I reckon every soul deserves to know they matter, that their life has meaning beyond what others might think. Martha learned that lesson the hard way, but she learned it true. This story is about second chances, about how sometimes salvation comes wrapped in the most surprising packages, and how real love, the kind that lasts, grows quiet and steady, like good corn in rich soil. Martha Lewis dropped her gathering basket, dried grass scattering across the meadow like tumbleweeds. The smell of autumn hung heavy in the air, that mix of dying leaves and coming frost that told a body winter wasn't far behind. She ran toward the motionless figure sprawled near her fence line, her heavy work boots catching in prairie dog holes, nearly sending her tumbling face first into the dirt. The stranger lay still as death, face down in the brown grass. One arm was twisted beneath him, something awful, and his dark hair was matted with what looked like dried blood. Martha could smell it now, that metallic scent that made her stomach turn over. Lord have mercy, she thought, stopping 3 feet away to catch her breath. The man wore clothes she'd only seen from a distance when the fancy folks came through town: fine wool coat, leather boots with silver buckles that caught the late afternoon sun. Quality goods. Expensive goods. His horse stood nearby, favoring its left front leg. The poor creature's eyes rolled white with pain, and Martha could see the unnatural angle of its fetlock. Broken bad. The kind of break that meant only one thing. Martha's throat tightened. She'd seen enough injured animals to know this one wouldn't be getting up again. She knelt beside the unconscious man, her worn calico dress spreading in the dust like a faded flower. The smell of him hit her: sweat and blood and something else. Fear. Maybe. She pressed her ear close to his back, listening hard for the rise and fall of breathing. There. Faint as a whisper, but steady enough. "Mister?" She touched his shoulder gentle-like, the way she might wake a sleeping child. Nothing. Not even a twitch. His face was turned away from her, half buried in the prairie grass that grew thick as a carpet out here. Careful as she could manage, Martha brushed the hair from his forehead. A gash ran from his temple clear to his hairline, crusted over with blood that looked several days old. The coffee she'd drunk that morning turned bitter in her stomach. This man had been lying here a while. Days. Maybe. Martha sat back on her heels, wiping her hands on her apron. The practical part of her mind, the part that had kept her alive these 7 years since Pa died, was already calculating. She could leave him here, pretend she'd never seen him, walk back to her cabin and let someone else find him come morning. That would be the safe choice. But Ma's voice echoed in her memory, clear as church bells on Sunday morning. "Martha, girl, you do what's right, not what's easy. The Lord sees everything, even when folks think nobody's watching." She studied the man's face in the dying light, even unconscious and busted up. She recognized him. Daniel Crowley, owner of the biggest spread in 3 counties. The man whose riders she watched from her porch each evening, driving cattle across the distant hills like something out of a picture book. He lived in a world so far removed from hers that she'd never imagined their paths crossing. Rich folks like him had their own doctors, their own people to tend them when trouble came calling. And here he was, broken and helpless in her meadow, depending on her for his very life. The irony wasn't lost on her. Martha Lewis, the woman the whole town pitied behind her back. The spinster nobody wanted, nobody noticed, And Daniel Crowley needed her now more than he'd ever needed anyone. Martha pushed herself to her feet. Decision made. She couldn't lift him alone. Daniel Crowley was a tall man, broad through the shoulders like someone who'd spent his life working cattle. But her farm cart sat beside the cabin. And if she could get it here, maybe she could manage. The walk back gave her time to think, time to worry. What would folks say when they discovered she'd taken in Daniel Crowley? The townspeople already whispered about her when they thought she couldn't hear. Poor Martha Lewis. Such a shame. 32 years old and never been courted. Wonder what's wrong with her. She knew what was wrong with her. Had known since she was old enough to look in a mirror and see what stared back. Her face was too round, her body too soft, her whole presence too easily overlooked. She'd learned to move through town quick-like, eyes down, speaking only when spoken to. But none of that mattered now. A man was dying in her meadow, and she was the only soul for miles around who could help him. Martha hitched her old mule to the cart, her hands moving with practiced efficiency despite their trembling. The sun hung low in the western sky, painting the prairie grass gold and amber like something from one of those fancy paintings rich folks hung on their walls. Soon it would be dark, and October nights in Colorado territory could freeze a body solid. The cart bumped and swayed across the uneven ground, wheels creaking a lonesome tune. When she reached Daniel, he hadn't moved so much as an eyelash. His breathing seemed shallower now, more labored. Getting him into the cart proved harder than wrestling a bull calf at branding time. She managed to roll him onto his side, then worked her arms under his shoulders. Her back strained something fierce as she lifted, and sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cool air. Dead weight. Pa would have called it. The kind that fought you every inch of the way. Inch by painful inch, she dragged him to the cart. The wooden bed sat 3 feet off the ground, too high to lift him alone. Martha looked around desperate-like, then began stacking stones from her fence line to make steps. By the time she had Daniel loaded, her dress was torn at the shoulder, and her hands were scraped raw as fresh meat. The injured horse watched her efforts with sad, knowing eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the animal, her voice catching. There wasn't nothing she could do. The horse would have to wait for whoever came looking for Daniel Crowley. If anyone came looking at all, the trip back took twice as long as usual. Martha walked alongside the cart, one hand on Daniel's shoulder to steady him when the wheels hit ruts deep enough to jar his bones. His skin felt hot through his shirt fever setting in like a prairie fire. Her cabin squatted in a grove of cottonwood trees, their leaves yellow as butter in the fading light. Smoke drifted from the stone chimney. Carrying the smell of the beans she'd put on to cook that morning, home had never looked so welcome, or felt so small. Getting Daniel from the cart to her bed took every ounce of strength the Lord had given her. She half carried, half dragged him through her front door, then collapsed beside him on the narrow mattress, gasping for breath like a landed fish. The cabin's single room seemed to shrink with his presence. Her familiar space, the kitchen table she'd inherited from Ma, the trunk that held her few good dresses, the shelf lined with mason jars and Pa's worn books, all of it felt different now. Changed. But there was no time to fret about that. Daniel's fever was climbing higher than summer wheat. Martha lit her coal oil lamp and set it on the bedside table. The yellow light revealed the full extent of his injuries, and her stomach lurched. Besides the gash on his head, his coat was torn in several places, dark stains suggesting wounds beneath his fine clothes. She'd tended injured animals plenty of times, horses cut by barbed wire, cattle with infected brands. But this was different. This was a man, and not just any man. This was Daniel Crowley. Her hands shook like autumn leaves as she fetched scissors from her sewing basket. His clothes would have to come off, so she could see what she was dealing with. The thought made her face burn hotter than a cook stove. But there wasn't no choice in the matter. Martha had never undressed a man before, had never seen a man without his shirt, except for glimpses of field hands working in summer heat. She approached the task like any other necessity, keeping her eyes focused on the wounds rather than the person beneath the clothes. The head injury was the worst, deep enough to need cleaning, but not deep enough to kill. Praise the Lord. His shirt revealed bruises along his ribs dark as thunderclouds, and a shallow cut on his left arm that had bled considerable. Nothing that wouldn't heal, given time and proper doctoring. She worked through the night like a woman possessed, cleaning wounds with water heated over her fire, tearing strips from old sheets to use as bandages. Daniel never fully woke, though he muttered occasionally in his fever dreams, words she couldn't quite catch, fragments of conversations she wasn't meant to hear. By dawn, Martha's back ached like she'd been plowing rocky ground, and her eyes burned from lamp smoke. But Daniel's fever had broke, and his breathing came easier. She settled into Ma's rocking chair beside the bed, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest. Sunlight streamed through her single window, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits. Outside, she could hear her chickens clucking in their pen, waiting for their morning feed, life continuing on as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Martha knew that, sure as she knew her own name. The moment she'd decided to help Daniel Crowley, she'd stepped off the safe, narrow path she'd walked for 32 years. She had no earthly idea where this new path would lead. But for the first time in longer than she cared to remember, she wasn't walking it alone. Before we continue, I'd love to know which city you're watching from. Let's get back to the story. Daniel's eyelids fluttered like moth wings against lamplight. Martha jerked upright in her rocker, the wooden runners scraping against the plank floor. She dozed off despite herself, chin resting on her chest while the morning sun climbed higher. Coffee had gone cold in the tin cup beside her chair, a skin forming on top like ice on a winter puddle. His lips moved, shaping words that had no sound. Then his eyes opened gray as storm clouds staring at the log ceiling without seeing. Where? The word came out dry as corn husk, barely a whisper. Martha's elbow knocked the water pitcher clean off the bedside table. Tin clattered against wood, and she scrambled to right it, her fingers clumsy with sudden nerves. Water splashed across her boots and soaked into the rough planks. Easy now, she said, refilling the cup from what was left in the pitcher. You're safe. Daniel tried pushing himself up on his elbows. His face went white as fresh milk, and he dropped back against the pillow with a sharp intake of breath. His hand went to his head, fingers exploring the bandage Martha had wrapped around his skull during the long night. My horse hurt bad, I'm afraid. Martha held the cup to his cracked lips. Drink some of this. He managed a few sips before turning his head away. Water dribbled down his chin onto the patchwork quilt Ma had sewn 20 years back. Martha dabbed it with her apron hem, then pulled her hand back quick when she realized how close she'd moved to his face. Who are you? Daniel's voice was stronger now, though still rough as a cob. Martha Lewis. She spoke her name like she wasn't sure she had the right to claim it. Daniel's gray eyes focused on her face for the first time. She watched recognition dawn slow, not of her personal, but of what she represented. A woman alone. Poor. Different from the ladies in town with their store-bought dresses and Sunday manners. "And you're Daniel Crowley," Martha said before he could speak. His eyes went wide as saucers. The silence stretched between them, tight as fence wire in winter. "Why?" he asked finally. Martha smoothed her hands over her skirt, pressing at wrinkles that wouldn't come smooth no matter how hard she tried. "Couldn't leave you?" The words hung in the air heavy as humidity before a storm. Outside, a crow cawed from the cottonwood beside her cabin. Martha could hear her old mule stomping in the corral, waiting for hay. Normal sounds from her normal life, except nothing felt normal anymore. Daniel studied her face with an intensity that made her want to look anywhere but at him. But she forced herself to meet his gaze, her chin lifting just a hair. "Your head was split open," she said. "Been 3 days since I found you." 3 days? Daniel struggled to sit up again, this time managing to prop himself against the wall. The quilt slipped, showing the clean bandages wrapped around his ribs. Martha turned away quick, busying herself with the water pitcher. When she looked back, Daniel was staring at his bare chest, at the careful work of her doctoring. His eyes found hers across the small room. And Martha realized with a cold certainty that cut through her like January wind, everything was about to change. But what she couldn't know, what made her pulse quicken with something between fear and anticipation, was whether Daniel Crowley would see her as his salvation or his ruin. Daniel's hand shook like a man with the palsy as he reached for the water cup. Martha watched the tremor travel up his arm, saw how his jaw clenched tight against showing weakness. The cup tilted dangerous-like, spilling water across the quilt before she could steady it with her own hands. "Here now?" Martha's fingers brushed his as she guided the cup to his lips. His skin felt hot and dry, like leather left too long in summer sun. He drank slow, his throat working with each swallow. A drop escaped the corner of his mouth, and Martha had to fight the urge to wipe it away. Instead, she pulled her hand back and folded it proper in her lap where it belonged. "How long was I—" Daniel's voice cracked like a boy's. He cleared his throat and tried again. "How long was I out there?" "Can't rightly say. Found you yesterday morning. But that gash was already healing some." Martha stood and moved to the window, needing distance between them. "Could have been days." Through the glass, she could see buzzards circling lazy in the distance. His horse, most likely. The thought made her stomach turn sour. "My men will be looking." "Haven't seen nobody." Martha turned back to face him. "Been quiet as Sunday service out here." Daniel tried swinging his legs over the side of the bed. His face went white as fresh snow, and sweat popped out across his forehead like dew on grass. Martha took a step forward, then caught herself. "You ain't ready for that," she said. "I can't stay here." Daniel's voice carried an edge that made Martha's chest feel tight. "Folks will talk." Martha felt heat climb her neck like spilled coffee. Of course they would. She was the kind of woman folks talked about, the spinster who lived alone. Too big and too plain for any decent man to want. Having Daniel Crowley in her bed would give the town gossips enough fodder to last clear through winter. "Nobody's gonna know," she said quiet-like. "Less you tell them." Daniel's gray eyes searched her face, like he was trying to read words written in a foreign tongue. Martha kept her expression smooth as pond water, though her hands trembled as she smoothed her apron. "I need to get word to my foreman," Daniel said. "Jake Morrison. He'll be worried sick." "Can't help you there." Martha moved to the stove and began fixing thin broth from yesterday's chicken bones. "Got no horse, and town's 8 miles on Shank's mare." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the bubble and pop of broth in the pot. Martha could feel Daniel watching her as she worked, but she kept her back turned. Easier that way. Safer. Miss Lewis. She glanced over her shoulder. Daniel had managed to sit up straighter, though the effort cost him. Sweat dampened his hair at the temples like he'd been working hay in August heat. Martha, she corrected him. Martha. The way he said her name made something flutter in her chest like a trapped bird. Why did you help me? She turned back to the stove, stirring the broth harder than necessary. Told you. Couldn't leave you. But why? The spoon clinked against the side of the pot. Martha set it down and gripped the stove's edge, the cast iron cool under her palms despite the fire burning inside. My mama always said you help folks that need helping, she said finally. Didn't matter who they were. Even someone like me. Martha turned around slow. Daniel was looking at her with an expression she couldn't rightly place. Not pity, she'd seen enough of that to recognize it quick. Something else. Something that made her pulse quicken despite herself. What do you mean? Someone like you? Rich. Important. Daniel's mouth twisted bitter as green persimmons. The kind of man who wouldn't give you the time of day in town. The words hit Martha like a slap across the face. She felt shame burn through her, but she kept her voice steady as Sunday hymn singing. Maybe so. But you ain't in town now, are you? She ladled broth into a chipped bowl and carried it to the bed. Daniel accepted it with both hands, his fingers still unsteady. Steam rose from the surface, carrying the scent of herbs she'd added sage and wild onion gathered from the prairie. This is good, Daniel said after his first careful taste. Martha shrugged. It's just broth. No, it's more than that. Something in his tone made her look up sharp. Daniel was watching her again, but this time she didn't look away. His gray eyes seemed different, somehow softer, maybe, or maybe she was just fooling herself. You saved my life, Daniel said quiet-like. Anyone would have done the same. No. Daniel shook his head slow. No, they wouldn't have. Martha felt tears prick at her eyes, but she blinked them back quick. She wasn't used to kindness from strangers, especially not from men like Daniel Crowley. It made her chest ache in a way that scared her considerable. You should eat, she said, changing the subject like switching horses midstream. Get your strength back. Daniel nodded and took another sip of broth. Martha busied herself tidying the cabin, wiping down the table that was already clean, straightening the few books on Pa's shelf, anything to avoid looking at him. But she could feel his presence in her small space, changing everything just by being there. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows like bones in a bag. Storm coming. By the sound of it. Martha glanced at the clouds gathering dark on the horizon and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Martha? Daniel's voice was quieter now. Tired as a man who'd worked cattle for 18 hours straight. She didn't turn around. Yeah. What happens when they find me here? Martha's hands went still on the dish towel she'd been folding. She'd been trying powerful hard not to think about what would happen when Daniel's men came looking, when the whole town learned that Martha Lewis had been alone with Daniel Crowley for days. She turned to face him, and the fear in his eyes matched her own, because they both knew the answer to his question, even if neither wanted to say it out loud. But as Martha opened her mouth to speak, a sound froze the words in her throat. Hoofbeats, coming fast up the trail to her cabin. And from the thunder they made, there was more than one rider heading their way. Daniel's bowl slipped from his hands like a greased pig at a county fair. The crash of crockery against the wooden floor made Martha jump near out of her skin. Broth splattered across her boots and soaked into the rough planks, spreading dark as spilled coffee. Daniel stared at the mess, his face flushed red as a barn door. Confound it. I'm sorry. Don't fret none. Martha dropped to her knees and began gathering the larger pieces, her skirt spreading around her like a faded flower. It was cracked already anyhow. Daniel leaned forward, reaching for a shard near the bed's edge. His movement was too quick for a man still healing. His face went gray as winter sky, and he gripped the mattress edge with knuckles white as fresh milk. Leave it be, Martha said. You'll cut yourself, sure. But Daniel had already picked up the piece, turning it over in his palm. It was the handle of her mama's good bowl, the only nice dish Martha owned in this world. This was important to you? Daniel's voice was quiet as prayer. Martha's hands went still. She sat back on her heels, broken pieces cradled in her palms. Was my mama's? I'll buy you another. Can't buy that one back? Martha stood and dumped the pieces into her slop bucket with a sound like rain on a tin roof. But it's just a bowl. Daniel watched her sweep up the smaller bits with a corn husk broom, his gray eyes following each movement like he was memorizing how she worked. When Martha glanced up, she found him still staring. What is it? You're not mad. Martha paused, broom halfway across the floor. Why would I be mad? Most women would be. Carrying on, making a fuss. Daniel shifted against the pillow, wincing. My Sarah would have. He stopped short as a gate slamming shut. The silence stretched between them thick as molasses. You're married. Martha's voice came out smaller than she intended, barely more than a whisper. Was Sarah died 3 years back? Fever took her? Martha nodded and went back to sweeping. Though her hands shook now, she'd heard tell of Sarah Crowley, a delicate flower of a woman who'd come from Denver society to marry the rancher. Beautiful as a china doll, from what folks said. Everything Martha could never be. I'm sorry for your loss, she said. She would have hated this place. Daniel's eyes moved around Martha's cabin, taking in the rough-hewn walls, the single room, the simple way of everything. Too plain, too quiet for her taste. Martha bristled like a cat with its back up. Ain't much, but it's clean. That's not what I meant. Daniel's voice turned sharp as a whip crack. She needed more. Fancy parties, store-bought dresses, folks to impress with her fine ways. Martha swept the last bits into her dustpan. Metal scraping against wood. Sounds lonely. It was. The words hung between them like smoke from a dying fire. Martha emptied the dustpan and set her broom aside. When she turned back, Daniel was looking at her different, like he was seeing her instead of just looking through her. Reckon I should fix you something else to eat, Martha said. I'm not hungry. You need to eat. Build your strength back up. Martha. The way Daniel said her name made her stop fidgeting with her apron. Sit down a spell, please. Martha perched on the edge of her rocking chair, hands folded proper in her lap. The chair creaked under her weight, a sound she'd always been conscious of, furniture protesting when she used it, but Daniel didn't seem to notice. Tell me about this place, he said. Nothing much to tell. You live here alone? Martha nodded. Since Pa died. That was 7 years back now. And before that, lived here with Pa and Mama till she passed when I was 20. Then just me and Pa. Martha's fingers worried the edge of her apron like she was working worry beads. Always been here. Daniel shifted, trying to find comfort on the old rope spring mattress. The bed groaned under his weight like it was complaining about the extra burden. You never wanted to pull up stakes, go to Denver, maybe Kansas City. Martha laughed. but it came out bitter as burnt coffee. With what money? Besides, who'd want someone like me in a big city? Why do you do that? Do what? Talk about yourself like you're nothing special. Heat flared in Martha's chest like kindling catching fire. I ain't talking about myself like nothing. I'm talking about myself like I am. And what are you? The question caught Martha sideways like a calf that won't go where you're trying to drive it. She stared at Daniel, her mouth opening and closing without sound. What was she, a spinster past her prime? A woman too plain and too soft for any man to want. Someone the town pitied when they bothered thinking of her at all. I'm nobody special, she said finally. Daniel was quiet for a long spell. Outside, the wind had picked up considerable, making the cabin walls creak like old bones. The coal oil lamp flickered, sending shadows dancing across the room like spirits at a seance. The woman who saved my life, Daniel said at last. The woman who's been taking care of me for 3 days, asking nothing back. That's nobody special. Martha's throat felt tight as a new rope. You don't know me? I know you could have left me to die. I know you gave up your bed and slept in that hard chair. I know you fed me the last of your good broth. Daniel's voice was getting stronger, more insistent. I know you tore up your own sheets to bandage my wounds. Anyone would have... No. Daniel's interruption was sharp as a slammed door. No, Martha, anyone wouldn't have. Most folks would have sent for the sheriff and washed their hands clean of it. You brought me into your home. Martha stood up sudden-like, the chair rocking behind her. I should check on the animals. It's getting dark. They still need tending. Martha grabbed her shawl from its peg by the door. As she reached for the latch, Daniel spoke again, his voice softer now. My Sarah never tended animals, never cooked a proper meal or mended so much as a torn shirt. She was beautiful, right enough, but she couldn't do any of the things that actually matter. Martha's hand froze on the door latch. She didn't turn around. I'm not saying she was bad, Daniel continued. Just, she didn't know how to take care of things, take care of folks. She didn't need to, Martha said quiet-like. She had money. Had you to do for her? Money doesn't fill an empty belly. Money doesn't heal a wound or comfort a fever. Martha turned the latch and stepped onto her small porch. The evening air was cool against her face, carrying the scent of coming rain and the distant smell of wood smoke from some neighbor's chimney. Behind her, she heard the bed creak as Daniel tried to sit up straighter. Martha. She paused in the doorway, but didn't look back. Thank you, Daniel said. Not just for the doctoring, for treating me like a person instead of a name on a deed. Martha closed the door and leaned against it, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Through the thin wood, she could hear Daniel moving around inside the scrape of the water pitcher, the rustle of bedclothes settling. She walked to her small corral where her old mule stood waiting. Ears pricked forward at her approach, as she forked hay into the feed trough. Martha tried to make sense of the strange ache in her chest. When she returned to the cabin, Daniel had managed to light the second lamp. The room glowed warm as honey, chasing away the shadows that always seemed to gather in the corners come evening. He was sitting up in bed, back propped against the log wall, looking stronger than he had since she'd found him. Storm's coming, Martha said, hanging her shawl on its peg. I can hear it building. Martha busied herself banking the fire for the night, adding just enough wood to keep the coals alive till morning. She could feel Daniel watching her, but she didn't look up from her work. Martha? When I'm well enough to travel, what will you tell folks about me being here? Martha's hands went still on the fire poker. She'd been dreading this question, knowing it would come eventually, but hoping to put it off a spell longer. Won't tell them nothing, she said. "Ain't nobody's business but ours." "They'll ask questions when word gets out I was missing." "Let them ask." Martha replaced the poker in its stand. "Don't mean I got to answer. It could cause you trouble. Folks talking, making up stories about what happened here." Martha turned to face him. "What kind of stories?" Daniel's eyes dropped to his hands. "You know what kind." The silence stretched between them, heavy as storm clouds. Martha felt heat climb her neck as she understood what he meant. People would assume the worst, that she'd taken advantage of an injured man, that something improper had happened in her cabin. "Let them think what they want," Martha said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "I know what happened here, and so do you. That's all that matters." Daniel looked up, meeting her eyes across the room. "What did happen here, Martha?" The question hung in the air like the scent of rain before a downpour. Martha stared at Daniel, her pulse quickening at the intensity of his gaze. And suddenly she realized she didn't rightly know the answer anymore. But before she could speak, a new sound reached them through the cabin walls, the unmistakable clip-clop of a horse, walking slow and deliberate up her trail. Someone was coming. And from the careful way they moved, Martha had the powerful feeling they didn't want to be heard. Daniel's feet hit the cabin floor with a thud that shook the whole room. Martha spun around from the stove, wooden spoon dripping cornmeal batter like yellow rain. Daniel sat on the edge of the bed, his bare feet planted on the rough planks, gripping the mattress edge with both hands. Sweat beaded across his forehead from the simple effort of sitting upright. "What in tarnation are you doing? Getting up!" Daniel's voice was strained but determined as Sunday morning service. "Can't lie in that bed another blessed day. You'll fall flat on your face sure as sunrise." "Maybe so." Daniel pushed himself upright slow as winter molasses. His legs trembled like aspens in a breeze, but he stayed standing. "But I'm tired of being useless as teats on a boar hog." Martha set the spoon aside and moved toward him, hands outstretched in case he went down like a felled tree. Daniel took one careful step, then another. His third step sent him stumbling sideways into the wall, shoulder hitting the logs with a solid thunk. "Darn fool, man," Martha muttered, catching his elbow before he could slide down the wall like spilled syrup. Daniel leaned against the logs, breathing hard as if he'd been running fence lines all morning. "Used to be I could break horses. Now I can't walk across a room without falling down like a drunk cowpoke." "You will again, Lord willing. Takes time is all." "How much time?" Martha studied his face, the stubborn set of his jaw, the frustration burning in those gray eyes like banked coals. She'd seen the same look on injured animals. That wild need to be whole again, fighting against the body's weakness. "Long as it takes," she said plain. "Can't rush healing no more than you can rush corn to grow." Daniel pushed off from the wall and took another step. This time he managed 3 before his knees buckled like green timber under too much weight. Martha caught him under the arms, her body pressed against his side as she held him steady. "Easy now," she whispered, her breath stirring the hair at his temple. Daniel's weight settled against her, solid and warm as sun-heated stone. Martha could feel the rise and fall of his breathing, smell the lye soap she'd used to wash his hair mixed with something purely him leather and hay, and open sky. For a moment neither of them moved, frozen like deer that heard a twig snap. "I'm too heavy for you," Daniel said finally, his voice rougher than usual. "I'm stronger than I look." "I reckon." Daniel turned his head to look at her. Their faces were close enough that Martha could count the gold flecks in his gray eyes, see where her razor had missed whiskers along his jaw yesterday morning when she'd shaved him. "Yes," Daniel said quiet as prayer. "You surely are?" Heat bloomed in Martha's chest like wildflowers after spring rain. She helped Daniel back to the bed, then returned to her cornbread, hands shaking as she stirred the yellow batter. "Tomorrow," Daniel said from behind her. "I'll try again tomorrow." "Tomorrow you'll still be weak as a newborn calf." Then the day after that, Martha poured the batter into her iron skillet and slid it into the oven. When she turned around, Daniel was trying to stand again, this time using the bedpost for support like it was a crutch. "Lord, save me from stubborn men," she said, but there was no real complaint in her voice. Daniel grinned, the first real smile she'd seen from him since he'd been conscious. It changed his whole face, made him look younger, less like a wealthy rancher and more like the boy he must have been once. "My foreman Jake says the same thing regular like, usually with more colorful language." "I'll bet he does at that." Martha watched Daniel practice standing, his grip white-knuckled on the bedpost. Each time he tried to let go, his legs shook with the effort of holding his weight, muscles quivering like guitar strings. "Here now?" Martha pulled her pa's old chair closer to the bed. "Use this if you're bound and determined to be up and about." Daniel gripped the chair back and took a careful step. The chair scraped across the floor like fingernails on slate, but it held his weight. He managed to shuffle halfway across the cabin before sinking into Martha's rocking chair with a grunt of effort. "Better?" Martha asked. Daniel nodded, chest heaving like he'd been running cattle. "Much obliged." Martha served him cornbread warm from the oven, cut thick as her thumb and spread with the last precious bit of butter she'd been saving. Daniel ate with steady concentration, finishing every golden crumb. "Fine eating," he said when he was done. "It's just cornbread, nothing fancy. Best I've had in a month of Sundays." Martha felt heat creep up her neck like spilled coffee. "You're just hungry is all." "No." Daniel met her eyes across the small table. "It's good because you made it with care. I can taste the difference." The words hit Martha like a soft blow to the chest. She stood up quick, gathering the empty plates with hands that trembled just a touch. Men didn't say such things to women like her, not unless they wanted something she couldn't give. "I should milk Bessie," she said. "I'll come along." Martha paused, plates balanced in her hands. "You can barely walk to that chair without falling over." "I can try." "Why would you want to?" Daniel was quiet for a long moment. When Martha looked at him, his expression had gone serious as a preacher on Sunday. "Because I've spent 3 days watching you tend to everything while I lay there like a sack of grain. I want to help. You're hurt. I'm getting better, thanks to you." Martha set the plates in her wash basin and wiped her hands on her apron. Outside, Bessie was lowing in the corral, her udder full and uncomfortable, waiting for evening milking. "All right then," Martha said finally. "But you fall down. I'm leaving you where you land." Daniel used the chair to push himself upright. "Fair enough." The walk to the corral took near 10 times longer than usual. Daniel leaned heavy on Martha's arm, stopping every few steps to catch his breath. By the time they reached Bessie's stall, sweat had soaked clear through his shirt. Martha settled Daniel on an overturned crate and fetched her 3-legged milking stool. Bessie shifted restless-like as Martha positioned the bucket and began the familiar rhythm that had been second nature since she was knee-high to a grasshopper. "How do you do that?" Daniel asked, watching her hands work. "Practice is all." Martha's hands moved in steady pulls, milk ringing against the bottom of the tin pail like metal rain. "Been milking cows since I could walk without falling down." "Show me how." Martha's hands went still. "What's that now?" "Show me how to milk her." "You want to learn cow milking." "I want to learn to be useful around here." Martha studied Daniel's face in the dying light. He wasn't joshing her. The earnestness in his expression was clear as creek water. Something shifted in her chest. warm and unexpected. All right then. Martha stood and gestured to the stool. But Bessie's particular about who touches her. She don't take kindly to strangers. Daniel eased down onto the stool, his movements careful as a man walking on thin ice. Bessie turned her large brown eyes toward him and snorted through her nose. She doesn't cotton to me, Daniel said. She doesn't know you yet. Martha knelt beside him, close enough that her shoulder brushed his arm. Give me your hands. Daniel held out his hands, palms up. They were larger than hers, with long fingers and calluses from years of ranch work, but soft now from lying idle. Martha placed them on Bessie's warm flank, covering them with her own smaller hands. Feel that? Martha asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She's nervous. You got to calm her first. Let her know you mean no harm. Daniel's hands stilled under Martha's guidance. Gradually, Bessie's breathing slowed, her muscles relaxing under their joined touch. Now the milking. Martha moved Daniel's hands to the cow's udder, her fingers guiding his. Gentle but firm. Like you mean it, but you ain't trying to hurt nothing. Martha's hands covered Daniel's as she showed him the rhythm squeeze and pull. Squeeze and pull. His fingers were clumsy at first, but he caught on quick enough. The first few squirts of milk missed the bucket entirely, splattering on the ground. I'm terrible at this, Daniel said, frustration creeping into his voice. You're learning, is all. Martha adjusted his grip, her touch light as bird wings. There now, try again. This time the milk hit the bucket with a satisfying ping. Daniel's face lit up like a child's on Christmas morning. I did it. You surely did. They worked together in comfortable quiet, Martha's hands guiding Daniel's until he found the proper rhythm. Gradually, she let him work alone, stepping back to watch with something that felt dangerously close to pride. This is harder than it appears, Daniel said, milk now flowing steady into the bucket. Most worthwhile things are... Daniel glanced up at her, milk still streaming from his hands. Is that why you do everything yourself? Because it's easier than teaching someone else how... Martha's chest tightened like someone had pulled a rope around it. Ain't been nobody else to teach? There is now. The words hung between them heavy as summer air before a thunderstorm. Martha felt her pulse quicken as Daniel held her gaze, something passing between them that had no name but felt real as the ground under her feet. A horse whinnied in the distance, high and sharp. Martha's head snapped up, listening hard. There it was again, the unmistakable sound of a horse approaching at a hard gallop, hooves drumming against packed earth. Daniel heard it too. His hands went still on Bessie's flank, milk forgotten. Someone's coming fast, Martha whispered. Daniel struggled to his feet, nearly knocking over the milk bucket in his haste. His face had gone pale as fresh cream. My men, he said, they found me. Martha's blood turned cold as mountain snow. Through the gathering dusk, she could make out a single rider cresting the hill that overlooked her small spread. Too far to see clear, but close enough to know they had maybe 5 minutes before he reached the cabin. What do we do? Martha asked, though she already knew the answer was nothing good. Daniel met her eyes across the dim corral, and Martha saw her own fear reflected back at her, like looking into still water. Because they both knew that in 5 minutes, absolutely everything was going to change. And there wasn't a blessed thing either of them could do to stop it. The hoofbeats grew louder, drumming against the earth like thunder rolling across the prairie. Martha's hands flew to Daniel's arm, helping him steady himself against the fence post. His shirt was damp with sweat from the simple effort of milking. and now fresh perspiration beaded across his forehead like dew on morning grass. "Get back to the cabin," Martha said, her voice tight as new rope. "Quick as you can manage." "I can't move that fast, not yet." "Then you better try." Daniel took a stumbling step, then another. Martha grabbed his elbow as his knees buckled like green wood under strain. The sound of approaching hooves echoed off the hills, now a single rider pushing his mount hard enough to lather. "Who would be riding hell for leather at this hour?" Martha asked. "Someone who's been searching for days." Daniel leaned heavy on her shoulder, his breathing labored. "Someone who's worried sick." They made it halfway to the cabin before Daniel stopped, chest heaving like a bellows. The rider had crested the final hill, and Martha could see him clear now, a man in a worn leather vest and wide-brimmed hat, mounted on a bay horse dark with sweat. "That's Jake," Daniel said. "My foreman." Martha's stomach dropped like a stone down a well. She'd heard plenty about Jake Morrison, a hard man who'd worked for the Crowley spread for 15 years, loyal as a hound dog and twice as protective of his boss. "You could hide," Martha said desperate-like. "In the root cellar, maybe." "No." Daniel straightened his shoulders despite his obvious weakness. "I won't hide from my own man like some yellow belly. But if he sees you here, he'll see me standing beside the woman who saved my life." The words hit Martha like a slap across the face. She stared at Daniel, her mouth opening without sound. Before she could respond, Jake's horse thundered into the yard, scattering chickens in all directions like feathers in a windstorm. Jake pulled up short, his mount dancing sideways as he took in the scene. His eyes moved from Daniel to Martha, then back to Daniel. His weathered face went through a mess of expressions: relief, confusion, and something that looked dangerously close to anger. "Boss?" Jake's voice was hoarse, as a man who'd been shouting over cattle all day. "Lord Almighty, we've been looking everywhere." Daniel stepped forward, putting himself slightly in front of Martha. "Jake, 5 days you've been missing. 5 long days." Jake swung down from his saddle, boots hitting the ground with a solid thump. "Found your horse with a busted leg 3 miles south of here. Figured you were buzzard bait for sure." Nearly was. Jake's eyes fixed on the bandage wrapped around Daniel's head, then moved to Martha again. This time his gaze lingered, taking in her simple dress, her work-roughened hands, the way she stood slightly behind Daniel like she was trying to disappear. "Ma'am?" Jake's tone was careful as walking on ice, but Martha heard the question underneath. "This is Martha Lewis," Daniel said. "She found me and brought me here." "Found you where?" "Inner meadow. Horse threw me during that big storm last week." Jake nodded slow-like, but his eyes never left Martha's face. She felt heat crawl up her neck under his scrutiny, like standing too close to a cook fire. "We're much obliged to you, ma'am," Jake said finally. "For helping the boss." "Wasn't nothing special," Martha managed. "Wasn't nothing?" Jake's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline like squirrels up a tree. "Lady, do you have any notion who this man is?" "Jake?" Daniel's voice carried a warning sharp as barbed wire, but Jake wasn't finished. "This here's Daniel Crowley. Owns more land than you could ride across in a week. Employs half the men in 3 counties. His gaze swept over Martha's modest cabin, her small corral, the obvious poverty of her circumstances. "And you say helping him wasn't nothing?" Martha's face burned hotter than a branding iron. She knew what Jake was thinking, what any sensible person would think, that she was nobody, that helping someone like Daniel Crowley was the biggest thing that would ever happen in her small, forgettable life. "That's enough," Daniel said, his voice sharp as a whip crack. Jake's attention snapped back to his boss like a dog called to heel. "Sir, with all due respect, the whole territory's been looking for you." Sheriff's got posies out. Your business partners from Denver are asking hard questions. Then we better get word out that I'm alive. Yes, sir. Jake glanced at Martha again, then back to Daniel. You able to ride? Daniel was quiet for a moment, and Martha could see the war playing out across his face. He was weak still, barely able to walk across the cabin without help. But Jake's presence had changed everything, reminded them both of the world waiting outside Martha's small sanctuary. I'll manage, Daniel said finally. The words felt like a door slamming shut in Martha's face. She took a step backward, putting more distance between herself and the two men. This was how it ended then. Daniel would ride away with his foreman, back to his ranch and his responsibilities, back to his real life where she had no place. I'll get your things, she said quiet-like. Martha? But she was already walking toward the cabin, her spine straight and her head high. She wouldn't give Jake Morrison the satisfaction of seeing her fall apart like wet paper. Inside, Martha moved with the efficiency of long practice. Daniel's clothes, washed and mended careful as Sunday stitching. His boots, cleaned and oiled till they shone. The few personal items she'd found in his pockets, a silver pocket watch, a leather wallet, a small photograph of a woman who must have been his wife. Through the window, she could hear Jake's voice rising and falling in urgent conversation, probably telling Daniel about the business he'd missed, the decisions that needed making, the life that couldn't wait any longer for one injured rancher. Martha folded Daniel's shirt with the same care she'd give her mama's best quilt, smoothing out every wrinkle. Her hands trembled only slightly as she worked. She'd known this moment would come, had been dreading it and expecting it in equal measure. The door opened behind her with a creak of hinges. Martha didn't turn around. Martha? Your things are ready. She placed the folded clothes on the table neat as pins. Jake's probably anxious to get you home before full dark. We need to talk about this. Nothing to talk about. Martha moved to the stove, busying herself with banking the fire that didn't need banking. You're well enough to travel. That's what matters. Is it? The question made Martha's hands go still on the poker. She stared into the dying flames, afraid to turn around, afraid of what she might see in Daniel's face. Your foreman's waiting, she said. Let him wait. Martha heard Daniel's uneven footsteps as he moved closer. The cabin seemed to shrink around them, the walls pressing in like they were trying to listen. Look at me, Daniel said. Martha shook her head. Please. Something in his voice made her turn despite herself. Daniel stood 3 feet away, his gray eyes intense in the lamplight. The bandage around his head made him look vulnerable despite his obvious determination. What happens now? He asked. You go home. Get back to your life. And you? Martha shrugged. I go back to mine. Just like that, just like that. Daniel took a step closer. What if I don't want it to be just like that? Martha's breath caught in her throat like a fishbone. What are you saying? Before Daniel could answer, Jake's voice called from outside, sharp with urgency. Boss, we really should get moving. Storm's coming in fast. Daniel's jaw tightened with frustration that was plain as day. Through the window, Martha could see Jake pacing beside his horse, glancing repeatedly at the darkening sky where clouds boiled black as tar. He's right, Martha said. You should go. Daniel stared at her for a long moment. Then he reached out and took her hand, his fingers warm and calloused against her palm. This isn't finished, he said, quiet as prayer. Yes, it is. No. Daniel's grip tightened. It surely isn't. He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. The touch sent electricity shooting up her arm like lightning, making her gasp. Then he was moving away, gathering his belongings with quick efficiency. Martha stood frozen by the fire, her hand still tingling from his kiss. "Boss," Jake's voice was sharper now. "We got company coming." Daniel's head snapped up like a deer hearing wolves. Martha moved to the window and peered out into the gathering dusk. There, on the ridge overlooking her property, 3 riders sat silhouetted against the storm-dark sky. "Who is that?" Martha whispered. Daniel joined her at the window. His body pressed close to hers as they both strained to see. The riders weren't moving, just watching, waiting. "I don't rightly know," Daniel said. "But they've been up there for a spell." Jake appeared in the cabin doorway, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "Boss, we got ourselves a problem. Those men up there, they ain't ranch hands." Martha's blood turned cold as winter creek water. The riders sat motionless on the ridge, dark shapes against the storm-heavy sky. She couldn't make out faces at this distance, but something about their stillness felt wrong, predatory. "How long have they been watching?" Daniel asked. "Don't know for certain," Jake said. "Just noticed them when I looked up from checking my saddle." Daniel moved away from the window, his movement suddenly sharp and focused despite his injuries. "Martha, pack whatever you need. You're coming with us." "What? No. I can't." "Look at me." Daniel's voice was steel wrapped in velvet. "Those men didn't ride up here by accident. They've been watching this cabin, watching us." Martha stared at him, her mind struggling to make sense of what he was saying. "But who would—" "I don't know. But I'm not leaving you here alone to find out." Through the window, Martha saw one of the riders raise something to his face, a spyglass, catching the last rays of dying sunlight. And in that moment, she realized with cold certainty that Daniel was right. They weren't just watching the cabin, they were watching her. But what made her blood freeze in her veins wasn't the watching itself. It was the slow, deliberate way the man with the spyglass turned his mount and began riding down the back slope of the ridge, heading straight for the trail that led to her cabin. The riders were gone. Martha pressed her nose against the window glass, her breath fogging the pain as she searched the ridge line. Empty as a church on Monday. Just purple shadows where 3 men had sat watching her cabin for the better part of an hour. "They're moving," Jake said from the doorway, rifle cradled in his arms like a sleeping baby. Heading down the back slope toward the main road. Daniel struggled to his feet from where he'd been sitting at Martha's table. "Can you see where they're going? Lost them in the trees? Could be anywhere by now." Martha's hands shook as she pulled back from the window. The cabin felt exposed now, its thin walls about as useful as paper against whatever those men wanted. "We need to pull up stakes," Daniel said. "Right now." "I can't." Martha's voice came out barely above a whisper. "This is my home." "Won't be your home if you're dead." The words hit Martha like a fist to the gut. She sank into her rocking chair, the familiar creak offering no comfort. Everything was happening too fast. An hour ago, she'd been teaching Daniel to milk Bessie. Now strange men were watching her cabin, and Daniel wanted her to abandon everything she'd ever known. Heavy boots stomped on her porch outside. Jake spun toward the door, rifle coming up quick as a snake strike. "Easy there, Jake," a man's voice called from outside, smooth as Sunday preaching. "Mayor Wilson here. Come to check on Mr. Crowley's welfare." Daniel and Jake looked at each other like they were sharing bad news without words. Martha felt her stomach drop clear to her boots. Mayor Wilson meant official business. Town business. Let them in, Daniel said quiet-like. Jake hesitated, then lowered his rifle and opened the door wide, and 3 men filed into Martha's cabin, their black Sunday suits looking foreign in the simple space. Mayor Wilson led the parade, followed by Doc Peters and Banker Hayes. All 3 wore identical expressions that said they'd come to fix something that was broken. Martha shrank deeper into her chair as their eyes swept over her cabin, taking in the single room, the rumpled bed where Daniel had been healing, the intimate closeness of everything. Daniel! Mayor Wilson removed his hat, revealing hair slicked down with enough pomade to grease a wagon wheel. Thank the Lord you're alive. When Jake sent word you were missing, I'm fine. Mayor. Yes, we can see that plain enough. Doc Peters stepped forward, his medical bag clutched like a shield. Though you look like you've been through the mill, that head wound has been tended proper. Daniel moved closer to Martha's chair. Miss Lewis here saved my life. The 3 men turned their attention to Martha for the first time. She felt their gazes like physical weight, taking note of everything: her worn dress, her work-rough hands, the way she seemed to fold in on herself under scrutiny. Miss Lewis? Mayor Wilson's tone was careful as walking on thin ice. We're grateful for your assistance. To Mr. Crowley. Martha nodded but couldn't find her voice. It felt stuck in her throat like swallowed cotton. Quite a coincidence, Banker Hayes said, his pale eyes moving between Martha and Daniel like he was adding numbers that didn't balance. You finding him in your meadow like that? Not a coincidence, Daniel said, sharp as winter wind. Good fortune. Of course, of course. Hayes's smile was thin as paper. Though some folks might wonder about the propriety of the arrangements here. Heat flooded Martha's cheeks like spilled coffee. She gripped the arms of her rocking chair till her knuckles went white as fresh milk. What arrangements would those be? Hayes. Daniel's voice had gone dangerously quiet. Now tomorrow? Daniel? Mayor Wilson said quick-like. Nobody's questioning anything. We're just concerned about Miss Lewis's reputation. A woman alone, caring for an injured man. People do talk. Let them talk. It's not that simple. Doc Peters set his bag on Martha's table with a thump that seemed to shake the whole cabin. Miss Lewis has to live in this community. We all do. Martha found her voice at last, though it came out smaller than she intended. I didn't do nothing wrong. No one's saying you did, Mayor Wilson said. But his tone suggested otherwise, like he was humoring a slow child. It's just that appearances matter in a small town. Surely you understand that... What I understand, Daniel said, is that Martha found me dying and nursed me back to health. Without her, I'd be feeding the worms by now. And we're grateful, Hayes said, truly grateful. But the fact remains that you've been alone together for near a week, unchaperoned. The word hung in the air like smoke from a grease fire. Martha felt shame burn through her chest, hot and suffocating. They were right. Of course. She'd been alone with Daniel for days, tending his most private needs, sharing the close space of her cabin. By the town's way of thinking, she was ruined, sure as rain. Miss Lewis took advantage of your condition. Doc Peters said, blunt as an axe blade. Some might even say she compromised you deliberate-like. That's enough. Daniel's voice cracked like a bullwhip. But Doc Peters wasn't finished. A woman in her situation might see opportunity in an injured, wealthy man. Perhaps she saw a chance to better her circumstances considerable. Martha's vision blurred like she was looking through water. The shame was crushing now, pressing down on her chest till she couldn't breathe proper. She wanted to defend herself, to tell them how wrong they were. Instead, she sat frozen in her chair, drowning in their accusations. "Get out!" Daniel's words were barely audible. "Now, Daniel, get out of this cabin. Now." Mayor Wilson held up his hands like he was calming a spooked horse. "There's no call for hostility. We're trying to help here. Surely you can see that Miss Lewis has compromised herself, and you, by association." "The only thing I see," Daniel said, "is 3 men insulting the woman who saved my life. We're not insulting anyone." Hayes adjusted his spectacles with a precise movement. "We're being realistic. Miss Lewis is, well, she's not the sort of woman men typically court. Finding you injured might have seemed like providence to her." Martha made a small sound like a wounded animal. The words cut deeper than any knife blade. She pressed her hand to her mouth, fighting back the sob that wanted to tear free. Daniel took a step toward Hayes, his face white with rage despite his weakness. "Say another word about her and you'll what?" Hayes smiled, cold as January frost. "Create more scandal. Make things worse for everyone involved." "Gentlemen," Jake's voice cut through the tension like a sharp blade. He'd been silent until now, standing guard by the door. "Might want to continue this conversation elsewhere. We still got those riders out there somewhere." "What riders?" Mayor Wilson asked. 3 men been watching this place. Don't recognize any of them." The officials exchanged glances, quick as card players. Mayor Wilson cleared his throat. "Well, that's concerning, but it doesn't change the immediate situation." "Which is what exactly?" Daniel asked. "Miss Lewis needs to be removed from temptation, and you need to distance yourself from this entanglement before it damages your standing in the community, permanent-like." Martha shot to her feet, her chair rocking wild behind her. "Get out!" The 3 men turned to stare at her like she'd grown a second head. Martha was trembling now, but her voice came out steady as bedrock. "Get out of my house. Miss Lewis. Now." Mayor Wilson's mouth tightened like a drawstring purse. "I understand you're upset, but we're trying to protect you from yourself." "Protect me?" Martha laughed, but it came out bitter as burnt coffee. "You come into my home and call me a liar and worse, and you think you're protecting me?" Doc Peters flinched like she'd slapped him. "Nobody used such language." "Didn't need to. I heard what you meant clear enough." Martha moved to the door, yanking it open so hard it banged against the wall. Cold air rushed in, carrying the scent of coming rain. "Get out!" The 3 men filed past her slow as molasses, their disapproval rolling off them like heat from a stove. Mayor Wilson paused in the doorway. "Think careful about what you're doing, Miss Lewis. Your reputation is all a woman like you has in this world." "My reputation?" Martha met his eyes square. "What reputation would that be? Mayor? The fat spinster who lives alone? The woman nobody wants or notices?" Wilson's face reddened like a turkey's wattle. "There's no call for such talk. There's no call for you to be in my house either." Martha's voice rose till it was near a shout. "But here you were anyway, telling me what I am and what I done." The door slammed behind them hard enough to rattle the windows like chattering teeth. Martha leaned against it, her whole body shaking like an aspen in high wind. Through the thin wood, she could hear the officials talking in low, urgent voices. Their words were muffled, but the tone was clear anger, disapproval, the promise of consequences to come. "Martha." Daniel's voice was gentle behind her. She didn't turn around. They're right. No, they're not. I am ruined. The words tasted like ashes in her mouth. Just by having you here, I'm ruined complete. You saved my life. And destroyed my own? Martha pressed her forehead against the door. What was I thinking that someone like you could... that I could... She couldn't finish the sentence. The humiliation was too complete, too crushing. Daniel's hand settled on her shoulder. Look at me. Martha shook her head. Please. Slow as winter coming. Martha turned around. Daniel stood close enough that she could see the pain in his gray eyes, the exhaustion that still marked his features despite his growing strength. What they said in there, Daniel began, was true. Martha's voice was flat as yesterday's bread. I am exactly what they think I am, a desperate woman who saw a chance and took it. Is that what you think happened? Martha stared at him. The question hung between them, loaded with implications she wasn't ready to face. Outside, horses snorted and stamped. The officials were leaving, but their words remained, poisoning the air of her cabin like smoke from green wood. I think, Martha said slow and careful, that I made a mistake. Daniel's face went still as pond water. What kind of mistake? Thinking that this could be anything more than what it was. You were hurt. I helped you. That's all there is. Martha. You should go. The words came out stronger than she felt inside. Jake's right. There's a storm coming. Daniel stared at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once, sharp as a nail being driven. Fine. He gathered his belongings with quick, efficient movements that spoke of years managing ranch business. Martha watched from beside the door, her arms wrapped around herself like armor that wouldn't hold. When Daniel finished packing, he paused beside her. This isn't over. Yes, it is. No. His voice was certain as sunrise. It surely isn't. He reached for the door handle, his hand covering hers where it rested on the latch. The touch sent electricity up her arm, but Martha forced herself to step aside. The door opened to show Jake waiting with the horses, storm clouds boiling across the darkening sky like black cotton. Daniel paused in the doorway. Those men who were watching. I can take care of myself? Can you? Before Martha could answer, Jake called out urgent from the yard. Boss company coming. 3 riders emerged from the tree line, moving at a steady trot toward the cabin. The same men who'd been watching from the ridge. As they drew closer, Martha could make out their faces in the dying light. She didn't recognize a single one of them, but Daniel obviously did. His face went pale as fresh milk, and his hand moved instinctive toward his hip where a gun should have been. Who are they? Martha whispered. Daniel's jaw tightened like a spring under pressure. Trouble. But even as he said it, Martha caught something else in his expression. Something that made her stomach drop like a stone down a well. Because Daniel wasn't just worried about these men. He was afraid of them. The rider stopped 50 yards from Martha's cabin, close enough for conversation but far enough to run if trouble started. Their horses snorted and pawed the ground like they'd been ridden hard, steam rising from their flanks in the cool evening air. The lead rider was a thin man with a graying beard, his coat dusty from long travel. The other 2 flanked him, younger men with hard faces and eyes that missed nothing. Daniel Crowley, the bearded man called out, his voice carrying easy across the yard. Been looking high and low for you. Daniel stepped full onto Martha's porch, putting himself square between her and the riders. His legs still trembled some with the effort, but his voice came out steady as church bells. Brennan, what brings you to my territory? So Daniel knew this man. Martha pressed closer to the cabin wall, trying to make sense of the tension crackling between them like lightning before a storm. Business, Brennan said, settling back in his saddle like a man with all the time in the world. The kind that won't wait for nobody. Jake moved his horse sideways, positioning himself at an angle to the strangers. His rifle lay across his saddle within easy reach, though he hadn't touched it yet. "What kind of business?" Daniel asked. Brennan's pale eyes shifted to Martha, then back to Daniel. "Private business. Maybe the lady should go inside where it's safe." "The lady stays right where she is." Martha's chest tightened like someone had pulled a rope around it. She could feel violence hanging in the air, thick as humidity before a summer storm. These weren't ordinary visitors come calling. "Suit yourself?" Brennan leaned forward in his saddle, leather creaking. "Word is you've been thinking about selling the North Range. The section that borders the railroad easement." "Word's wrong." "That's so." Brennan's smile didn't reach his eyes. "My employer's got a different impression from certain sources. They're prepared to make a generous offer." "Not interested." "You haven't heard the terms yet." "Don't need to." Daniel's voice hardened like iron cooling. "That land's not for sale at any price." Martha watched the exchange with growing dread. She didn't understand all the particulars, but she understood the threat underlying Brennan's polite words clear enough. "See, that's where you're wrong," Brennan said, his tone still conversational. "Everything's for sale in this world. Just a matter of finding the right price." One of the younger men shifted in his saddle, his hand drifting toward his gun belt like he was scratching an itch. Jake's rifle moved slightly, not quite aiming but ready for trouble. "You boys are trespassing," Jake said quiet-like. "Might want to move along before dark." "Public road," the second rider said, his voice flat as hammered steel. "Free country. Last I heard. This ain't the road." The tension stretched tighter than fence wire in winter. Martha could feel her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She'd never been this close to real violence, the kind that left men bleeding in the dirt. "Tell you what," Brennan said, his tone friendly as a church social. "Why don't we discuss this like civilized men? Maybe over supper. I'm sure Miss—" He looked at Martha expectant-like. "Lewis," Martha said before she could stop herself. "Miss Lewis would be happy to cook for guests who rode so far." Martha's stomach clenched like a fist. The last thing she wanted was these men in her cabin, eating at her table, filling her small space with their barely controlled menace. "We already ate," Daniel said firm. "That's unfriendly." Brennan's smile turned cold as January wind. "After we rode all this way just to talk business, long ride back to wherever you came from," Jake said. "Best get started before the storm hits." Brennan studied Jake for a long moment, then dismounted slow and deliberate. His men followed suit, their boots hitting the ground with solid thumps that seemed to echo. "Actually," Brennan said, walking toward Martha's well without invitation, "we've been riding hard for days. Horses need rest. Water." He began pumping the well handle, water splashing into the wooden bucket below. His men spread out some, not quite surrounding the cabin, but positioning themselves strategic-like. "That's far enough," Daniel said. Brennan ignored him, cupping his hands to drink from the bucket. Water dripped from his beard when he straightened. "Nice place you got here, Miss Lewis," Brennan said, not looking at her direct. "Quiet, private, long way from town, and prying eyes." The words made Martha's skin crawl like ants were walking on her. She pressed closer to the cabin wall, wishing she could disappear into the logs. "Water your horses and go," Daniel said. "In a minute." Brennan wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. First, let's settle this business about the North Range. Nothing to settle? My employers think different. Brennan's tone remained conversational, but his meaning was clear as creek water. They got plans for that land. Big plans that could benefit everyone. Not my problem. Could be. Brennan turned to face them full. Accidents happen out here. Cattle get sick. Buildings catch fire. Folks living alone in isolated places. Well, they're vulnerable to all sorts of misfortunes. His eyes fixed on Martha as he spoke, and the threat was unmistakable now. Jake's rifle came up slightly. That sounds like a threat, mister. Just pointing out facts of life. Brennan smiled, but his eyes stayed cold. Life's uncertain, especially for folks who don't have protection. Daniel took a step forward, his hand clenched into a fist despite his obvious weakness. Leave her out of this. Hard to do that. Brennan's voice turned silky. Seeing as how you two been keeping company. Heat flooded Martha's face like spilled coffee. The implications in his words were clear and dangerous for both of them. What's between Miss Lewis and me is none of your concern, Daniel said. Oh, but it is. Brennan moved closer to the cabin, his men following. See? Man in your position can't afford scandal. Bad for business. Bad for reputation among decent folks. Martha felt the world tilt around her like she was standing on shifting ground. These men knew about the gossip, the speculation about her and Daniel. They were going to use it as a weapon. Get to the point, Daniel said. Point is simple as Sunday preaching. Brennan stopped at the base of Martha's porch steps. You sell us that land. We forget what we seen here. Your reputation stays clean as fresh snow. And if I don't, Brennan shrugged. Well, folks in town already talking about you and Miss Lewis. Wouldn't take much to fan those flames, especially if something unfortunate was to happen to the lady. Martha's breath caught in her throat. The threat was out in the open now, naked and ugly. You're making a mistake, Daniel said, his voice quiet as death. Am I? Brennan looked around Martha's modest spread with obvious disdain. Don't see how? You got everything to lose. We got nothing but time and opportunity. Jake's horse sidestepped nervous-like, sensing the tension. Martha could see sweat beading on Jake's forehead despite the cool air. Think it over, Brennan said, remounting his horse with easy grace. We'll be in town tonight. Staying at the hotel. Lot of folks to talk to. Lot of stories that could be shared. He touched the brim of his hat in mock politeness. Morning would be a good time for an answer, before too many people hear about your situation with Miss Lewis. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire. Martha felt sick to her stomach with the understanding of what they planned. One more thing, Brennan added, looking direct at Martha for the first time. Might be wise for the lady to visit relatives for a spell. Town can be dangerous for a woman with a damaged reputation. He wheeled his horse around, his men following suit. They rode away into the gathering dusk, taking their menace with them, but leaving the stench of it behind. Martha sagged against the cabin wall as soon as they were out of sight, her legs feeling weak as water. Who were those men? She asked. Railroad investors, Daniel said grim. They want to run a spur line through my North Range. Why? Shorter route to the mining camps up in the high country. Save them months of hauling ore the long way around. Martha tried to process what she'd heard, but her mind felt thick as molasses. They threatened me to get to you. Yes. The simple admission hit her like a physical blow. She'd become a weapon to use against Daniel, a weakness his enemies could exploit. I have to leave, she said quiet. No, You heard what he said. They'll spread lies about us. Ruin your reputation and mine both. Let them. Martha stared at Daniel in disbelief. You don't understand. You can't afford scandal. Not someone like you. Someone like me? Important? Wealthy? Respected? Martha's voice was bitter as burnt coffee. Everything I'm not. Daniel turned to face her full, and in the dying light his gray eyes looked almost black. You think I care more about what people say than I do about you? The question hung between them, loaded as a shotgun shell. Martha felt her pulse quicken despite everything that had happened. Before she could answer, Jake called out urgent from his horse. Boss, we got more company coming. Martha's heart sank as she saw dust rising from the road. Multiple riders this time, approaching fast in the gathering darkness. How many? Daniel asked. Jake squinted into the dusk. 5, maybe 6. Coming hard? Martha pressed her hand to her mouth, certain it was more threats, more men with demands and ultimatums. But as the riders drew closer, Jake's posture relaxed some. It's all right, he said. I recognize the lead rider. That's Tom Henderson, your neighbor, Miss Lewis. Martha felt a flicker of hope. Tom Henderson owned the spread next to hers, a decent man who'd always treated her fair when their paths crossed. The riders pulled up in her yard, their horses lathered from hard riding. Tom Henderson dismounted, followed by 5 other men. Martha recognized local ranchers and farmers, all neighbors of sorts. Evening, folks, Tom said, touching his hat brim. We came soon as we heard. Heard what? Daniel asked. About the trouble you've been having. Word is some railroad men been making threats around these parts. Martha blinked in surprise. How had they known so fast Mayor Wilson sent word around? Tom continued, said there might be trouble brewing, asked us to keep watch and help if needed. Martha felt something shift in her chest. The same officials who'd insulted her earlier had sent help. It didn't make sense. That's unexpected, Daniel said, echoing her thoughts. Tom's weathered face creased in a grin. Well, we look after our own out here, Miss Lewis included. He turned to Martha, his expression serious as Sunday service. Ma'am, I want you to know whatever folks might be saying in town, we know what kind of woman you are. Decent, honest, good neighbor who'd help anyone in need. Martha felt tears prick her eyes like needles. Tom, no need to thank me, just stating facts plain. Tom looked around at his companions, who nodded agreement. Any man gives you trouble has to answer to all of us. One of the other ranchers, a grizzled man named Pete Walsh, spoke up. That includes railroad vultures making threats against decent folks. Daniel stepped forward. I appreciate the support, but this is my fight. No, sir, Tom said firm. This is our fight. We all got property those railroad men want eventually. You're just the first they decided to lean on. Martha looked around at the faces of her neighbors, men who'd barely spoken to her before tonight but who'd ridden out to stand beside her when trouble came calling. Besides, Pete added with a grin that crinkled his eyes, Miss Lewis here makes the finest cornbread in 3 counties. Can't let anything happen to her on that account alone, despite everything. Martha felt a smile tug at the corners of her mouth. What do you propose? Daniel asked. Simple enough. Tom said, we take turns riding patrol. Make sure nobody bothers Miss Lewis or threatens her property. Railroad men want trouble. They'll find more than they bargained for. Jake nodded approval. I can coordinate with you boys. Make sure we got good coverage all around. Settled then? Tom remounted his horse. Miss Lewis, You need anything at all, you send word. One of us will be close by. As the men prepared to leave, Martha felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the knowledge that she wasn't completely alone in this world. Well, Daniel said quiet after they'd gone. That's a surprise. Tom's a good man, Martha said. They all are, in their way. Yes, they surely are. Daniel turned to look at her, his expression unreadable in the gathering darkness. Martha, about what Brennan said, don't. Martha held up her hand. Just don't talk about it right now. We need to face this. No, we don't. Martha moved toward her cabin door. You should go home, Daniel. Back to your ranch. Your real life. This is my real life. Right here. The words stopped Martha cold as Winter Creek water. She turned to stare at him, her heart hammering like a woodpecker on a hollow tree. What are you saying? Daniel took a step toward her, his eyes never leaving her face despite his obvious exhaustion. I'm saying I'm not going anywhere. Before Martha could respond, a new sound reached them, the rumble of wagon wheels on the hard-packed road. They turned to see a buckboard approaching, driven by a woman in a dark dress. As the wagon drew closer, Martha recognized the driver with growing amazement, Mrs. Henderson, Tom's wife. And the wagon bed was loaded with supplies, flour sacks, canned goods, and what looked like a bolt of fine fabric. But what made Martha's breath catch in her throat wasn't the supplies. It was the determined set of Mrs. Henderson's shoulders, and the way she was heading straight for Martha's cabin, like a woman with serious business to conduct. Mrs. Henderson's wagon creaked to a stop beside Martha's cabin like fate, arriving on wooden wheels. The older woman climbed down with the practiced ease of someone who'd been managing farm work since before Martha was born, her gray hair pinned severe beneath a black bonnet. She began unloading supplies from the wagon bed flour sacks heavy as grain, canned goods that clinked like coins, a bolt of blue fabric that caught the last light. Evening, Martha, she said without ceremony. Brought you some necessities. Martha stepped forward, confusion plain on her face as yesterday's wash. Mrs. Henderson, I can't pay for... Didn't ask you to. The older woman hefted a flour sack like it weighed nothing. Just being neighborly. Daniel moved to help, but Mrs. Henderson waved him off with a sharp gesture. You're still healing, Mr. Crowley. Let the women folk handle this. Martha felt heat climb her neck like spilled coffee. The implication was clear as creek water. Mrs. Henderson knew about Daniel's stay in her cabin, but instead of judgment in the older woman's eyes, Martha saw something else entirely. Something that looked dangerously like approval. Tom told me what happened, Mrs. Henderson said, carrying supplies toward the cabin. About those railroad scoundrels making threats? It's not your concern, Martha said. Course it is. Mrs. Henderson's tone brooked no argument. You're our neighbor. That makes it our business. She paused at the cabin door, studying Daniel with eyes sharp as a hawk's. You planning to marry this girl? The blunt question hit like thunder on a clear day. Martha's mouth fell open wide enough to catch flies. Daniel stared at the older woman, clearly caught sideways by her directness. Daniel began. Simple question, Mrs. Henderson said. Yes or no? Martha felt the world spin around her like a child's top. This couldn't be happening. Women like her didn't get marriage proposals from men like Daniel Crowley. Such things belonged in fairy tales, not real life. Mrs. Henderson, Martha said quick-like. There's no need to... Hush your mouth. The older woman's gaze never left Daniel's face. Well, Daniel looked at Martha, his gray eyes intense in the lamplight spilling from her cabin. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but certain as sunrise. Yes. The word hit Martha like a physical blow. She gripped the porch railing, her knees suddenly weak as water. Good. Mrs. Henderson nodded brisk. Then we best get to planning. Wedding dress won't sew itself. Wait, Martha said, her voice barely above a whisper. Just wait a blessed minute. Both Daniel and Ms. Henderson turned to look at her. Martha felt trapped between their expectant gazes like a rabbit between two foxes. I never said yes, Martha managed. Haven't said no either. Mrs. Henderson observed with the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating the weather. Martha stared at Daniel, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. You can't want to marry me? Why not? The simple question undid her completely. All the reasons tumbled out in a desperate rush. Because I'm nobody special. Because I'm poor as dirt. Because I'm beautiful, Daniel said quiet. Martha shook her head violent-like. Don't lie to me. I'm not lying. Daniel took a step closer. You are beautiful. Martha, not the way Sarah was beautiful, all delicate and decorated like a china doll. You're beautiful the way a sunrise is beautiful. Natural, real. Something that makes a man grateful just to witness it. Tears burned Martha's eyes, like smoke from green wood. No one had ever spoken to her that way. No one had ever looked at her and seen anything worth treasuring. The town will never accept it, she said. Some will, some won't. Daniel shrugged. I learned something this week. Lying in your bed, watching you take care of everything that needed doing, I learned that what the town thinks doesn't matter near as much as I thought it did. Mrs. Henderson cleared her throat like a preacher calling attention. If you two are done declaring feelings, these supplies need to come inside before it rains proper. As if summoned by her words. The first fat drops began to fall. Martha felt them splash against her face, cold and shocking as reality. Inside, Mrs. Henderson commanded like a general directing troops. All of us. They carried the supplies into Martha's cabin as the rain began in earnest, drumming against the roof with increasing force. Mrs. Henderson directed the operation with military precision, stacking goods on Martha's table and arranging the bolt of fabric with careful hands. This will do nicely for a dress, she said, fingering the blue material. Matches your eyes, dear. Martha stared at the fabric. It was beautiful, finer than anything she'd ever owned in her life. The kind of material she'd only admired from a distance in the general store window. I can't accept this, she said. Course you can. Already paid for. Mrs. Henderson began measuring the fabric with practiced hands. Now, when were you thinking of having the ceremony? We haven't even, Martha began. 2 weeks. Daniel said firm. Both women turned to stare at him. Daniel met their gazes without flinching. Those railroad men aren't going away, he said. The longer we wait, the more time they have to cause mischief. For both of us? That's not a reason to get married, Martha said. No, but it's a reason to get married quick. Daniel's voice softened like butter in summer sun. The real reason is standing right here. He moved closer to Martha, close enough that she could smell the lye soap she'd used to wash his hair, feel the warmth coming off his body like heat from a stove. Martha Lewis, Daniel said, his voice formal despite their closeness. Will you marry me? The question hung in the air like incense in church. Martha looked into Daniel's gray eyes and saw no pity there, no calculation, just a man asking a woman to share his life. Why? She whispered. Because you saved more than my life. Daniel said, You saved my soul. The words broke something loose in Martha's chest. She felt tears spill down her cheeks, but for the first time in years, they weren't tears of shame. "Yes," she said, so quiet it was barely audible. "What was that?" Mrs. Henderson asked. "Yes." Martha's voice was stronger now. "Yes, I'll marry you." Daniel's face transformed with relief and joy, bright as summer lightning. He reached for Martha's hands, enfolding them in his larger ones. 2 weeks, then," Mrs. Henderson said brisk. "Barely enough time to get everything ready, but we'll manage sure enough." Outside, the storm reached full strength. Rain hammered the cabin walls and lightning illuminated the windows in stark white flashes. But inside, warmed by lamplight and the glow of newfound hope, Martha felt safer than she had in years. "There's one thing," Daniel said, his expression growing serious. "Those railroad men will try to stop this. They'll see our marriage as an obstacle to their plans." "Let them try," Mrs. Henderson said grim. "They'll find we're not as helpless as they reckon." Jake, who had been quietly checking the windows and doors like a man expecting trouble, spoke up. "I'll post men around the property, discreet-like. Make sure nobody bothers the preparations." Martha felt overwhelmed by the support surrounding her like a warm quilt. A week ago, she'd been completely alone in the world. Now she had neighbors willing to stand guard. A woman preparing to sew her wedding dress. And a man who claimed to love her true. "I don't understand," she said. "Why are you all helping me?" "Because it's right," Mrs. Henderson said simple. "Because you're good people who deserve happiness. And because those railroad vultures need to learn they can't ride roughshod over folks in this territory." Thunder crashed overhead like the world splitting open, rattling the cabin windows in their frames. Martha moved to check the latch on her door, making sure it was secure against the storm. "We should plan the ceremony proper," she said, turning back to the others. "Where will we—" "Right here," Daniel interrupted. "In your garden, if the weather permits." "My garden?" Martha's voice was full of disbelief, but it's nothing special. "It's where I learned to see you truly," Daniel said, "where you taught me what real partnership looks like between a man and woman." "It's perfect." Mrs. Henderson nodded approval. "Outdoor ceremony, simple and honest. I'll talk to Reverend McKinley." "What about the reception?" Martha asked, still struggling to believe this was really happening to her. "Community affair," Mrs. Henderson said, decisive. "Everyone brings something to share. We'll use the Hendersons' barn if it rains." As they planned, Martha found herself swept along by their certainty. It felt like a dream, discussing flowers and food and music as if she were any other bride preparing for her wedding day. "Martha," Daniel's voice drew her attention like a magnet draws iron. "Are you sure about this?" The question was asked quiet, but Ms. Henderson heard it anyway. She looked up from the fabric she was arranging. "Course she's sure," the older woman said. "Aren't you, dear?" Martha looked around her cabin at the supplies covering her table, at Jake standing guard by the window, at Daniel watching her with patient eyes. Outside, the storm raged fierce, but inside felt like the calm center of a hurricane. "Yes," she said, and meant it down to her bones. "I'm sure as I've ever been about anything." Mrs. Henderson smiled and returned to her measuring. Jake resumed his watch. Daniel moved to help bank the fire for the night. But as Martha watched them all working to secure her happiness, a chill ran down her spine that had nothing to do with the storm outside, because through the rain-lashed window, she could swear she saw a figure watching from the tree line, and she had the sudden, certain knowledge that Brennan and his men weren't finished with them yet. Not by a long shot. Now, let me tell you something I've learned from watching folks like Martha and Daniel find each other against all odds. This story was born from a simple truth I've witnessed countless times in my years, that love often arrives not in grand gestures or fancy words, but in quiet moments of genuine care between two souls who see each other truly. Their tale reminds us that dignity isn't determined by circumstances or what others think, and that sometimes the greatest courage lies in allowing ourselves to be seen for who we really are. Martha's strength wasn't in changing herself to fit the world's expectations, but in finding someone who recognized her worth exactly as the Lord made her. Perhaps that's what we all seek deep down, not to be transformed into someone different, but to be recognized for the good that's already there beneath the surface. In a world quick to judge and dismiss, Martha and Daniel's story suggests there's profound beauty in the simple act of truly seeing one another with kind eyes. Disclaimer: this work is inspired by classic Western literature and created solely for entertainment purposes. The story does not condone, encourage, or promote any form of violence or harmful behavior. All characters and events are products of the author's imagination, and any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental.